Hello there, this is Air and Space History, a channel about the history of air and space. Today's video is going to be a brief history of rocketry and the space race. If you're interested in checking out the aviation version of this video, I posted that last week and I'll put a link in the description below. Anyways, let's cut to the chase and launch into the video. Simple rocketry was invented and utilized by several cultures even as far back as a millennium ago. No, the Chinese from the 10th century weren't exactly blasting off into space to explore the cosmos and land on the moon 900 years ahead of Neil Armstrong, but they were experimenting with gunpowder and particularly using it in bamboo tubes attached to arrows to propel them. Some historians place this invention as early as the 9th or 10th centuries. However, the first concretely reported use of this simple form of rocketry, which was essentially a very early solid fuel rocket, was in 1232 during the Battle of Kaifeng between the Chinese and the Mongols. The research and use of rocketry spread to Europe and the Middle East. However, by the 16th century, they were not used in war and rather just for frivolous things like fireworks. And I thought that fireworks were first created by wizards in gray robes at hobbits' parties. Anyways, some modest developments into rocketry continued for the following centuries up to the 20th century, but modern rocketry is said to have began in 1898 when the Russian scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky proposed the idea of liquid-propelled rockets and even space travel. In the early 1900s, an American named Robert Goddard, of which NASA Goddard Space Flight Center is named, conducted experiments with solid propellant rocketry before transitioning to liquid fuel, whereupon in 1926 he conducted the first liquid fuel rocket launch. It only went 12.5 meters in the air, but still, progress is progress, and liquid rockets were the way of the future. Goddard continued to develop better rockets and even preliminary guidance systems. Across the pond, Herman Oberth, born in Romania, also wrote about the uses of rocketry and space travel in 1923, which led to the creation of the Society for Space Travel in Germany. This society included a young scientist named Wernher von Braun and began the development of rockets for possible uses in the German army, which were not restricted under the Treaty of Versailles after Germany's defeat in the First World War. After the Society for Space Travel dissolved, Wernher von Braun and other German scientists continued developing rockets leading up to and during the Second World War, referencing the work of Goddard right up until the outbreak of war. Von Braun was the head of the Army Research Station responsible for the V-2 rocket, and in 1944, the V-2 rocket officially became the first object to reach space when it passed the Kármán line at 100 kilometers and reached a maximum altitude of 176 kilometers during a vertical flight test. The V-2 rocket, or A-4 as it was called in Germany, was used to attack London and can destroy an entire city block with its explosive payload. However, it simply came too late in the war and in too small numbers to make any real effect for the German army. After the Allied victory of the Second World War, the US commenced Operation Paperclip to bring von Braun and other German scientists into the US to continue their missile work since Germany had surpassed the Allied development in rocketry. The Soviet Union, while much less documented on the subject of German scientists, had the same attitude and policy, and it also began its rocket program. Following the war, things were about to get cold as both the Western democracies and the Soviet Union and Communist bloc emerged as superpowers with starkly different ideologies. The United States and the Soviet Union continued their rocket programs at a fairly unremarkable pace until in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite into orbit, kicking off the space race and setting the development of rocketry and spaceflight into a feverish pace. Let's all have a moment of silence for Laika, the first animal in space, a dog from the Soviet Union, who had an extremely terrifying and unfortunately one-way trip to space. She died soon after launch due to an unexpected temperature rise in the spacecraft. However, even if she had lived, there was no plan to safely return her to Earth. That's not to say that the United States is blameless either. In the decades prior, about 2/3 of all monkeys used in testing died during or after missions. Anyways, let's continue on despite our sadness. In the following year, in 1958, the United States was able to launch their first satellite, Explorer 1, notably later than the Soviet Union. Both countries turned their attention to the much larger goal of sending a human being into space. The Soviet Union had the clear upper hand in this endeavor, and for really all of the first half of the space race, and on April 12, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space and in orbit, flying aboard the Vostok K rocket. 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard kicked off the Mercury program and became the first American astronaut in space aboard the Redstone rocket. However, his flight was not designed to reach orbit. The first American would not reach orbit until the following year, when the Mercury program transitioned to the far more powerful Atlas rocket that was capable of sending John Glenn into orbit. Then, on September 12, 1962, President Kennedy gave his famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech, and the American spaceflight industry set its goals on that lofty target. To achieve that, however, much needed to be learned, including how to operate effectively in space. For that, the Gemini program was created, and the hardware was upgraded to launching a 2-person space capsule atop the Titan II rocket. Of course, before any of that happened, the United States was once again beaten to just about every space travel milestone by Russia. The Soviet Union launched the first woman in space in 1963, completed the first multi-crew flight in 1964, and did the first spacewalk in 1965, that is, leaving the capsule in a spacesuit. The United States would unfortunately not launch a woman into space themselves until 2 decades later, in 1983, when Sally Ride flew aboard the space shuttle. Anyways, late 1965 is when things began to turn around for the United States, and in December 1965, Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 rendezvoused in orbit, and the following year, Gemini 8 completed the first docking maneuver in space, all to practice for the upcoming Apollo program. The Gemini program concluded with Gemini 12 in November of 1966, signaling that the United States had the tools, technology, and experience to attempt to land on the moon. Unfortunately, 1967 saw the tragic Apollo 1 disaster, where a fire inside the capsule killed Roger Chaffee, as well as veteran astronauts Ed White and Gus Grissom during a launch simulation. Also in that same year, the first death during a flight occurred when Vladimir Komarov's parachute failed on Soyuz 1, causing it to impact the ground. Despite the tragedy of Apollo 1, the Apollo program to land on the moon persevered, and in October of the following year, 1968, Apollo 7 launched the Command and Service Module on the Saturn 1B rocket into low Earth orbit to begin tests. Apollo 7 did not carry a lunar module, however it did include the first live television broadcast from space. All Apollo missions would continue live broadcasting as the world watched along on the mission to the moon. After the Russians sent several animals, including 2 tortoises, around the moon and back in the Zond 5 mission, the United States decided to expedite its journey to get people there first. Apollo 8 again launched without a lunar module, but this time aboard the Saturn V rocket, allowing the crew to become the first humans ever to leave low Earth orbit and enter lunar orbit. In March of 1969, Apollo 9 stayed in low Earth orbit once again, this time to test the lunar module and the docking system, both of which worked successfully. Apollo 10, 2 months later, was effectively a dress rehearsal for the moon landing that did everything short of actually landing on the moon. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V rocket carrying astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins lifted off the pad at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The 3 astronauts took 4 days to fly to the moon, and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin boarded the lunar module to descend to the surface, while Michael Collins stayed aboard the command module. Despite several hiccups and issues encountered during the descent, which will actually be the topic of the next video on the channel, they were given clearance to proceed, and on July 20th, the lunar module set down on the surface of the moon. Neil Armstrong stepped out, broadcasting to the world, where he said his famous words,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Anyways, they would stay on the moon for 21 hours and 26 minutes until the top half of the lunar module, jettisoned from the landing portion, rendezvoused in orbit with the command module, and the 3 crew of Apollo 11 returned home. The capsule entered Earth's atmosphere at a blistering 24,000 miles per hour, or over 10 kilometers per second, and safely landed in the waters of the Pacific Ocean using its parachutes. This pretty much signaled the end of the space race, but certainly not of the Cold War. Anyways, the Apollo program had 5 more moon landings, each mission getting longer, exploring more, and even bringing a small lunar rover buggy to drive around in. The Apollo 13 incident was the only major issue that occurred during the missions to the moon, in which a small explosion in the service module attached to the capsule forced emergency procedures and a scrub landing. So, anyways, the Apollo program is arguably the peak of human space exploration, at least as I'm writing this in 2022, which is kind of unfortunate because it was over 50 years ago. With the end of the space race came the dawn of the space shuttle era, which was certainly an incredible vehicle and a feat of engineering, but it meant that humans pretty much confined themselves to low Earth orbit. There have been tons of explorative missions using robotics and unmanned spacecraft that I will certainly touch on this channel, and I'm sure I'll do some videos on the space shuttle, but the space race is what really excites me and is the era that I find most interesting and inspiring. Perhaps I'll do another video in the future documenting all of the milestones in spaceflight after the space race. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed hearing about a brief history of rocketry and the space race, and the same as the aviation one, we'll do many videos about the nitty-gritty details of all these events. For now though, I need to get going. I have an absolutely massive backlog of LEGO sets to build. Thanks for watching. See you next time.